Hello, and welcome to your introduction to Spanish-Quechua bilingualism in Peru. Your presenters today are Eliza Dempsey, Angie Mitchell, Elizabeth Mutunga, and Sarah Dowd. To study Quechua Spanish bilingualism, we need to go back in time and look at the history of the languages and how they came into being. So how did Quechua come into being? There are currently two main hypotheses for its origin. The first one is the Highland origin hypothesis. This hypothesis receives the most attention and is what is generally depicted in the oral history and traditions of the Quechua people. It depicts the origin of the language being centered around the Incan capital of Cusco. As an empire, the Incans conquered smaller tribes and communities. And as they conquered them, they desired linguistic homogeny, and therefore forced the people in those communities to learn Quechua. And eventually, as the Incan Empire spread, so did Quechua. The second hypothesis is the coastal origin hypothesis. This hypothesis is more or less the opposite of the Highlands hypothesis. It states that the amount of dialects and language change could not have happened over the 300 years of the Incan reign, and that there is evidence that Quechua had been evolving for almost 1,200 years. It claims that Quechua originated on the coast, and from there it spread to the southern Andean regions, a few centuries before the Inca formed their empire. The most significant piece of evidence towards this hypothesis is put forth by linguists that ascribe the Huayllash dialect to be the oldest variety of Quechua, which is actually still spoken today. Why it's the main source of evidence is because the roots of the language can be traced back to Proto-Quechua. And these linguistic divergences that are contained within this dialect are also found in West Andean regions, and therefore it is assumed that the origin of Quechua spread from the coast to the highlands and to the Andean regions, and was adopted and used by the Incan Empire as they came and rose to power. So what is Quechua pre-colonization from the Spanish? The Inca Empire, at its highest point, spread from Ecuador to Argentina. It took them many hundred years to do so, but over that time, they spread their influence and their language. At their highest point, they had around 10 million people, many of which were the people that they had previously conquered. Obviously, being the sheer amount of range that the Incan Empire contained, it was linguistically diverse. But in order for these communities to be adopted into Incan society, many were forced to adopt Quechua as its official language. Sadly, the Inca didn't have a writing system, so much of what is known about them is via oral history and tradition. They did have a number system, and it was documented on things called quipus, which is the images at the top. They used it by making little knots, and overall, that's how they indicated society. Young Inca nobles were also educated, but as I said, they didn't have a written language. So therefore, they spread cultural knowledge, often in the form of mnemonic songs and verses. Now, how did Spanish come into being? As for Spanish, it originated in the Iberian Peninsula and was evolved from Vulgar Latin. As the Roman Empire grew across Europe, it spread its influence and language. Sadly, whenever the Roman Empire dissolved, so did its influence over the areas it had previously conquered. This led to the Latin in the Iberian Peninsula to mutate on its own. And with influences from the languages native to the region and by other invaders, it eventually became Spanish, specifically known as Castilian Spanish. If we look at the image to the right, we can see it moving and changing. This shows how Spanish became, or the Castilian Spanish became more and more popular throughout the region of the Iberian Peninsula. In the 13th century, King Alfonso X made a push to have written documents of his reign and power, which led to a more standardized form of Spanish. With the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand, Castilian Spanish became the official language of the region. So where do we get the start of Quechua-Spanish bilingualism? It starts with Spanish colonization. So the Spanish colonization of the Americas began in 1492. And over the next 50 to 100 years, the Spanish spread their influences, war, and diseases across the continent. One of the most common diseases was smallpox, and it hit the Incan Empire as hard as it hit everywhere else. Overall, many Incans died, including the king of the time. After the death of the king, there ended up being a power grab by his heirs, which led to a civil war within the empire. This weakened the empire and therefore allowed the Spanish to invade and conquer the Incas. The conquering of the Incan Empire lasted between the years 1532 and 1572. And although Spanish had already started to spread throughout the fading Incan Empire as the Spaniards spread, it wasn't until Pizarro conquered Peru for Spain and Spanish colonization process began, and so did the Christianization and indoctrination of Spanish culture and values into Incan society. Between Spanish and Quechua contact and the Spanish mandates, there would inevitably be the lead to Quechua-Spanish bilingualism in Peru.
Hey everyone, my name is Sarah, and today I'm going to be talking to you all about the history of Quechua and how it has come to be a nation. First off, it's important to note, as Eliza mentioned earlier, that the Incan Empire's language for 300 years was primarily Quechua. The Incan Empire can be attributed to the first days of Quechua, and in order to understand Spanish-Quechua bilingualism, we must first understand the language's history. To begin, there are over 45 variations of Quechua as a language, and of those 45, they are divided into two groups, central and peripheral. An estimated total of 10 million people speak Quechua across the Andean countries, and 19% of those speaking Quechua reside in Peru. Quechua religion is a melting pot of Roman Catholicism and native beliefs. Quechua remains mainly a spoken language because there are no records of written documents in Quechua. It is also considered an official language in Peru and Bolivia. Also in Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina, it is spelled Quechua, how we know it, and it is called by the speakers of the language Runasimi. A few facts of the Quechua are that they have been known to have an important place in the agricultural aspects near the Andes Mountains and throughout history. It is the most spoken indigenous language throughout the Americas. Quechua also remains a mainly spoken language because there are no formal documents written in Quechua. Moving on to the idea of Quechua becoming a nation, Quechua has been a spoken language since the discovery of the Incan Empire roughly 600 years ago. Because of this, we can greatly attribute the Incan Empire to the discovery and continuation of the Quechua language. As Eliza mentioned previously, Spanish is the primary language of Peru, so how does Quechua still flourish despite the growing number of people speaking Spanish instead? The answer is hidden in the regions that are and have notoriously always been Quechua speakers. For example, in the department of Cusco in Peru, Quechua speakers make up 64% of the speakers of different languages. I will leave you with an excerpt from a 2001 article by Anna Ciroli, as she states, quote, "There exists a strange dichotomy between the pride in the history and culture of the Inca Empire, promoted by government and tourism sectors, and the disdain which, with the living descendants of this empire, are regarded. The unfortunate result of these attitudes is that many speakers, their linguistic roots, speaking a fractured Spanish with their children who learn to speak neither Quechua nor Spanish well, they prefer to pass as Spanish speakers."
Hi, everyone. I'll be talking about context and present of the Quechua and Spanish bilingualism. So it's been, the Quechua has been official language in Peru, and it's been used in the rural area for everyday communication in the informal context. And it's also an oral language. And on the other side, we have the Spanish being used as the formal context or the formal language, while the Quechua is used as extensively in traditional Indian music. Then we have Quechua as a strong base speakers and institutional support in Peru, and thus it has not been very official endangered according to the Peruvian government. And this is all according to Hamburger and King 2001. And in addition to that, if the current generation continue to not speaking Quechua, this leads to the negative impact of the Quechua, and that's why we're having unsuccessful Quechua bilingualism. And according to Garcia, we have many Quechua speakers who are anxious for their children to learn fluent Spanish, since if they don't do so, they will be nothing like peasant. That's what they feel, of which they should allow their children to speak both languages. And there's still a powerful attitude that place or puts Quechua in a very negative place, and that's why Quechua is not growing due to this negative attitude of the native speakers. Then we move on to the current language policy and practices. So according to the language policy, the Quechua has 3 vowels and 14 consonants, which is totally different from the Spanish. And the consonants has no voiceless and voiced opposition of the native Quechua words. When you look at the stress part, the stress comes towards the next last syllable, which brings in a totally different tonal variation or intonation. And this can clearly be heard from the way they speak. They stress the last syllable or the almost last syllables. And their nouns are not marked for genders. Genders distinctions are made by using specific auxiliary words when necessary, not every other time. And Quechua verbs are marked for persons, tense, and aspects. And when you compare the word order of Quechua, we have subject, object, and verb. And this is a bit different from also English, but at least Quechua has the subject, object, and verb. Then at least the bigger portion of the Quechua vocabulary has the borrowed words from the Spanish. So there's that. When you look at this, there's this a link between Spanish and Quechua because they have that borrowing of words and vocabulary. Quechua has been written using the Roman alphabet since the Spanish quest in Peru, and it was first written in 1560 in a dictionary of Domingo de Santo Tomas in some religious contexts until 20th century, and Quechua was written with Spanish-based orthography. So when we move on to the 1975, the Peruvian government adopted a new orthography for Quechua, which replaced the Spanish-based representation of certain sounds with letters that were more accurately reflected in the pronunciation of Quechua. And when you look into today's generation, there are proponents and opponents of the two orthographies. And the opponents argue that the new orthography makes Quechua writing harder to learn for people familiar with Spanish. And on the other side, the proponents claim that the new system better matches the phonology of Quechua. And in this case, that's according to me, the two-way immersion will really work better, which is the same as the Spanish and English in the US, which we had a good example in the Dr. Perry dissertation. From the pictures, we have the picture on the left side. It's a flower that is being stepped on. These are clear representation of how Quechua is growing. The bilingual language is trying to grow, but the native speaker, we have people who are against it, and that whatever they're doing makes it to fail. And on the other picture, we have students who are celebrating of how the bilingual education is being implemented in the college, and it's a good thing to lead to the successful of Quechua-Spanish bilingualism.
So I'm Angie Mitchell, and I want to talk a little bit about the discrimination of Quechua speakers. Millions of Latin Americans who do not speak Spanish or Portuguese are openly discriminated against. Indigenous people feel ashamed of their language, fearing mockery and rejection, and even refuse to teach their children. Linguistic exclusion exists for Quechua people, as well as economic, social, employment, health, and education discrimination. Of the total Peruvians without access to health services, 60% speak Quechua. There, at one time, and this is part of the debate about this particular language, the Quechua speakers, some of them want to be Spanish speakers, and then others want to maintain the Quechua language. So one document that I read said there was such shame associated with speaking Quechua that UNESCO declared it a vulnerable language, and in some areas of the country, it is even an endangered language, despite being one of Peru's official languages. So there are, in fact, several debates surrounding this. Quechua is the language of daily communication with family and community, but there's a mistrust of most government officials that exist among monolingual Quechua speakers as a result of a long history of repression and exploitation. Many of the speakers have had unpleasant experiences with those in positions of authority, and they tend to believe the idea that if these authorities want Quechua to be used in schools, then they must intend to keep children ignorant and backward. This belief may result in resistance to the use of Quechua in schools on the part of the parents, who want their children to be taught only in Spanish, which they consider a language of progress and power. Teachers also commented that some parents are opposed to the implementation of bilingual education. So negative attitudes towards Quechua cannot easily be banished by government. However, utilizing government resources towards raising the profile of Quechua with consistent consultation of Quechua speakers is an important first step in renewing people's pride in their language. Should it be taught in schools? So how, I think I skipped a slide, sorry. In the article, so how can an at-risk language be revitalized? In the article, Indigenous Language Revitalization in the Americas, the authors emphasize the importance of language policy and planning at the local and global levels. A plan must be carried out, evaluated for effectiveness, and modified if necessary. If all this is to be carried out in a systematic way, language shift will be reversed successfully, and in the process, the functional domains of the mosaic of linguistic landscapes will be increased at the societal level, and the rich repertoire of sounds and voices of the many speakers of Indigenous languages will still be heard and their knowledge and wisdom preserved for many years to come. So that's a quote from that article, Indigenous Language Revitalization in the Americas. So according to the authors, it is the right of a people group to have their children educated in their L1, and it is imperative that the Indigenous languages can be updated. And this is where it's important that these languages be updated with new technological terms and modern life in general, according to a quote. If students are to be taught in their native language, that must include academic vocabulary in all contents, and including new concepts in math, science, and technology. This connects to our text in Chapter 4, where Baker and Wright outline the possible reasons for language endangerment and policies needed to protect these vulnerable languages. However, the debates and arguments continue and may only offer strife and disconnect rather than solutions.